There are approximately 370 million Indigenous people in the world, belonging to 5,000 different groups in 90 countries worldwide. Although they only make up 5% of the global population, they account for about 15% of the extreme poor. Indigenous people's life expectancy is up to 20 years lower than that of non-Indigenous people worldwide. While Indigenous people own, occupy, and use a quarter of the world's surface area, they safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. They hold vital ancestral knowledge and expertise on how to adapt, mitigate, and reduce climate and disaster risk. Much of the land occupied by Indigenous people is under Indigenous customary ownership, and yet many governments recognize only a fraction of this land as formally or legally owned by Indigenous peoples. Insecure land tenures is a driver of conflict, environmental degradation, and weak economic and social development.
Let's take a look at our neighbors to the south. In Guatemala, according to the latest census, Indigenous people represent 41% of the total population, but other estimates place this number closer to 60%. Around 5.9 million Guatemalans identify as Indigenous, making it one of the largest Indigenous populations in the Americas. According to the 2018 census conducted by the National Institute of Statistics, about 41.5% of the population is mestizo, also known as Ladino, which is a mixed Indigenous and European heritage. A similar portion, 41%, are full Indigenous, which is among one of the largest percentages of Indigenous people in Latin America, only behind Peru and Bolivia. It is important to note that 0.1% of the population is Garifuna, which are people of African and Caribbean descent, and the remaining 18% of the population is of full European descent, called Criollo. Most of the Indigenous Guatemalans are of the Maya people, and the graph shows the percentage of different Indigenous cultures that make up the Maya people. While Spanish is the official language of Guatemala, there are also more than 22 Indigenous languages and dialects spoken by Guatemalan citizens. Many Indigenous citizens are monolingual in their native language and do not speak Spanish. Additionally, many officials and professionals are monolingual in Spanish, and this is a barrier for Indigenous people participating in health services and education. Even with the majority of Guatemala's population either of Maya or mixed Mayan descent, these populations suffer from extreme inequality in land access. Less than 3% of Guatemala's population owns more than 80% of the lands. This means that the Criollo elite hold access and control of most of the land and resources.
So, why the inequality, and why is most of the land, resources, and power in the hands of so few? The root cause can be discovered by looking at Guatemala's history.
Utilicemos nuestros teléfonos celulares, vecinos y vecinas. Cada uno de nosotros podemos contar la verdad con estos aparatos.
Para que Guatemala avance, tiene que haber justicia por las vidas que fueron tomadas y la tierra que fue robada.
A usted lo acusan de la comisión del delito de genocidio.
En Guatemala no hubo genocidio, en ningún régimen. En Guatemala no hubo genocidio.
No voy a descansar hasta verlos en la cárcel.
No es fácil ver a un asesino a los ojos y decirle, tú mataste a mi familia.
No ha habido ninguna prueba que evidencie mi participación.
Ordenando su ingreso directamente a prisión.
The disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations has resulted in an unstable economic state with stagnant development, sweeping violence, and high levels of migration, mainly in the direction of Mexico and the U.S. Adding to the inequality gap is a lack of political representation for Indigenous groups. As you can see from the table, only 12 current legislators identify as Indigenous.
Guatemala's Human Development Index ranking, placing them at 127th out of 189 countries, serves as evidence to poorer conditions racking the country. So, it comes as no surprise that much of the indigenous Guatemalan population lacks access to basic human needs such as proper nutrition, healthcare, education, and other social services, as they continue to suffer from discrimination. So, what is being done to mitigate these inequalities? With the country's weak tax structure, combined with its low rate of revenue, Guatemala heavily relies on foreign aid and official development assistance to fund social and economic growth programs. So the question we are faced with is, what impact does foreign aid have on the country's most vulnerable? In 2017, Guatemala received $366 million in ODA from international donors, and the data shows that a majority of the money went towards infrastructure and education. In 2018, Guatemala received $206.5 million in foreign aid from the USAID in the form of programming, and you can see from the table that a majority of the money went towards basic education and governance. A large amount of money flowing into Guatemala comes from remittances and accounts for 12% of the nation's GDP, which is more than FDI, foreign aid, and ODA combined. In 2018, the amount of remittances from immigrants totaled $9.3 billion US dollars. Data from the IMF shows that 31% of the recipients of remittances are indigenous, and that the remittances account for more than half of their monthly income. Research shows that indigenous households spend a majority of their money on housing first, then food, then education. In September of 2019, the U.S. has frozen aid to Central America, a total of $450 million, in an attempt to pressure those governments to create policies to stem the outflow of northbound migrants. Therefore, the Guatemalan government and its citizens may become even more dependent on remittances in the near future. Overall, Guatemala has seen some improvements in conditions in recent years due to USAID foreign aid programming. These include a decrease in homicide rates by half, the creation of 24,000 new jobs, and a 50% reduction in maternal mortality rates. According to the World Bank, its economy is expected to grow 3.3% in 2019, which is the highest it has been in decades. However, inequalities persist, with the indigenous peoples continuing to be particularly disadvantaged, as the 2018 World Bank census reconfirms. Despite major expansions of basic services in Guatemala, indigenous populations' access to sanitation and electricity is 18% lower than that of non-indigenous populations in the region. Indigenous families are 3 times more likely to be in poverty than non-indigenous families, and poverty averages about 79%, with 40% falling within extreme poverty. 75% of indigenous children under the age of 5 are chronically malnourished, and the rate of femicide is 3rd in the entire world. According to the Pan American Health Organization, of maternal mortality deaths, an average of 68% are indigenous women. It is argued that most of the foreign aid and government programs do not take cultural context into consideration. Top-down development approaches only drive inequality between the ethnic groups. Educational and healthcare programs implemented by foreign and domestic forces are culturally exclusive, with differences in values, preventing cohesion and growth in these sectors. For example, language barriers, cultural insensitivity, geographic barriers, gender norms, and fears by indigenous families of cultural erasure are causing school dropout rates of 53.5% among indigenous children. Our findings show that for Guatemala to achieve its development goals, its government and international organizations who implement social programs must find solutions that result in inclusivity, a challenge not only unique to Guatemala, but one that afflicts many countries and regions worldwide.